Scientists and experts tell us that we're now at a climate crossroads. If we don't act and act much faster than we're acting, we're going to be in a heap of trouble. But have you ever wondered, why aren't we making the progress we need to make in spite of all the evidence, all the science, and over half of the people around the globe saying we must and should do something about this? Well, if you've ever wondered, you must listen to our first live podcast that we recorded, where I interviewed and had a dialogue with three of the leading experts on this issue from around the globe. Dr. Rupert Read, founder of the Climate Majority Project and author of Transformative Adaptation. Bill McKibben, founder of Third Act and 350.org, a leading journalist and activist who was one of the first people to write about climate change in the late 1980s. And Brian McLaren, a leading theologian and pastor who wrote a book called Life After Doom and Everything Must Change. We had a 90-minute engaging, informative dialogue in front of a live audience, and you're going to want to listen and watch this podcast. So please, let's get going.
Welcome all. If you're joining us now for the first time, we'd love to see where you're from. We've got a chat box. We'll ask you to list your name and where you're joining us from. I'd love to hear and see where you're all calling from. Akron, Ohio, Oregon, Maryland, Minneapolis, Greensboro, UK, Scotland, Washington, Charlotte, California. Great representation. Thank you so much. Colorado, Scotland, Portland, Oregon, Montana, Atlanta. Great to have you all here with us. Well, let's get started. Glad to have you all here with us today. Welcome, everyone. I'm Diana Shoemaker, Executive Director of Elders Action Network, where we are mobilizing elders to create a thriving future for people and the planet. I, along with Jen Chandler, our Director of Elders Climate Action, are thrilled to welcome you to this special live edition of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. Our host, Dr. John Izzo, is a leadership expert, a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington, and the author of 9 books, including Stepping Up. Dr. Izzo has spent his career exploring how leaders in business and communities and society at large can step up to solve the challenges of our time. Today's conversation is all about the climate crossroads, the urgent choices we face, and how each of us can make a difference. We invite you to engage with us in this chat. Please let us know your name and where you're joining from, and feel free to connect with each other during the podcast. There is a separate Q&A for any questions that you have for the panelists. We'll get to some of those later in the webinar. If you'd like to learn more about the work we do here at Elders Action Network and the Elders Climate Action, please check us out online. Now I'd like to turn it over to our host as we kick off what is sure to be an engaging and inspiring conversation. Dr. John.
Thank you, Diana, and welcome to all of you wherever you are tuning in from today. We're glad that you're here in this important moment of a climate crossroads. I am Dr. John Izzo, and I am co-host of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. I know some of you already follow our podcast, and for some of you, this is new to you. And in a moment, we'll be putting in the chat box our link tree if you want to learn more about the podcast, and we'll mention a little more about that later. We're excited because this is our first live event, even though we've done close to 50 episodes of the podcast, including, by the way, all 3 of the guests we have here today have done individual podcasts with us. And I encourage you later on to check those out because all 3 of them are engaging and interesting and provocative in their own right. But today we're excited to do our first live event, and you get to be a part of it. And we really are in an important moment. We've had decades of science, activism, and awareness, and yet emissions are still rising. In many ways, ecosystems are continuing or accelerating their collapse, and political will across the globe seems, at least at the highest level, paralyzed. So the question we want to ask in this conversation today with our 3 distinguished guests is, why haven't we made more progress, and how can we now? We don't want to bore you today with a lot of speeches. We don't want to go over territory that many of you already know, in terms of the core science. We're assuming many of you have come here because you care about this issue and have studied it. we want to ask the question, how do we make progress? I'm only going to do a very brief introduction of our three guests today. Right to my left is Dr. Rupert Read from the United Kingdom. I like to think of him, I have a little phrase for each one of these guys, but I like to think of Rupert as an academic who left his robe behind to become a climate catalyzer, including being one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion and Climate Majority, and the author of a new book, Transformative Adaptation, which we did a podcast on, and I recommend to you highly. And then, as holding up the book, I love it. All authors should do that. Then we have Brian McLaren. And I like to think of Brian as a theologian, but a minister who had a second conversion. He grew up as a conservative pastor in a conservative religious tradition, and then had a kind of wake-up call that he talks about in his book and the podcast we did with him, and led him to write a groundbreaking book called Everything Must Change. But by Brian's own admission, everything has not changed 20 years later. And his latest book, Life After Doom, really explores the role of embracing and facing what we're looking at right now, and how do we have a spiritual response to it. And we're really glad you're here, Brian. And finally, last but not least, Bill McKibben, who was one of the first people to write about global warming and climate change in the late 1980s when he was a journalist at the New Yorker. He is a journalist at heart, but an activist at his center. And he not only founded 350.org, but Third Act, that's activating elders across the United States. And his new book, Here Comes the Sun, was also about the emerging solar revolution across the world, which I'm sure he'll mention today, was a recent podcast we did on that book. I recommend it highly. So, gentlemen, welcome, and welcome to all of you. So I want to start giving each one of you, even though this will be a conversation today, your only chance to kind of go completely solo, which is, even though we're at this crossroads and so many of us are so worried, what would be a headline for you of something we should feel good about in terms of how far we've come nonetheless? And Brian, I'm going to let you go first on that. Well, what should we feel good about in terms of how we've come?
Okay. Let me give you two versions of my headline, John. One would be, the more shocking one would be, the old way is not working, and that's good news. Another way to say it would be, something is trying to be born. I think the fact that the climate crisis is inseparable from oligarchy, the massive transfer of Earth's wealth, both human wealth and the Earth's wealth, to a small number of individuals, families, and corporations, that coexists with breakdowns in democracy and a kind of return to a kind of neo-feudalism, perhaps, and a much more overt oligarchy. When you put all of these and other problems together, you realize that the current system is not working. And what that means is the changes that are needed for climate change, if we don't work together to make those basic necessary changes, then the system will collapse, and that will require the basic necessary changes. So that's where I'd start.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rupert.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic with what Brian has just said. I would say my top general headline for what should make us encouraged, even pleased at the moment, is that human beings have the capability, and this isn't as widely understood as it should be, human beings have the capability to make fantastic things out of terrible things. A lot of my work for the last 10 years has been very much about looking for the upside of down. And well, there's a lot of down there for us to potentially find the upside of. And we can do that. It's real. For example, the way that Rebecca Solnit has written in my opinion, her best book, The Paradise is Built in Hell, fantastic title, how disasters can be the making of us. So we've got a lot of disasters baked in now. They can be the making of us. I'd add one more specific point along the same lines, which is public respect for the climate COP process has, I'm afraid for good reasons, deteriorated quite a lot over the last several years. But that is an opportunity. If people are no longer able to outsource to the COPs their own collective salvation, then they'll be forced to try to find that for themselves together. And that, I think, is the backdrop to the kind of conversation we're going to be having here today, how we can help to make that happen.
Thank you. And Bill?
Well, I'm not sure that there are fantastic headlines to be written, not at a moment when the jet stream is wobbling, the Gulf Stream has begun to flicker and falter, when we're seeing deep systemic damage to the most basic Earth systems, and when, at least in our country, democracy is flickering and faltering too. But if one were looking for those things to be pleased about, the Earth is generating a third more power from the sun this autumn than it was last autumn. And as a kind of demonstration project in what a different future could look like, beginning January 1st, the people of Australia will get 3 free hours of electricity every afternoon. Human beings have spent the last 700,000 years working hard to pay for the energy that they needed, whether by gathering wood or paying their electric bill. And we're at least beginning to get intimations of how a world that relied on the sun and the wind might be a very different place.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I want to begin the kind of expand our conversation now to think about maybe why we're stuck, why we're not making the level of progress that we can. And there are different ways people might frame this. Some might say it's a technological problem. Some might say it's a political problem, a special interest problem. Some people might say it's a spiritual problem. And I want to kind of have a little conversation here about what is the primary, the barrier that really stands in the way of greater progress. And Brian, I wanted to have you start the conversation, because one thing strikes me in your book, Life After Doom, is I think that you make the point that this is a spiritual problem as much as a technological or political problem. But let's all talk about what, with each other, what is the main barrier that we face?
Well, just to get us started, a lot depends on how we define spiritual, but if what we mean by spiritual is the deepest part of us, the deepest desires, the deepest story that we perceive ourselves to be part of, the deepest set of values that guide us. And we have been so shaped by centuries of especially economic values, that in many ways have done an end run around our professed religious values. That set of values is not working. And to reframe that set of values, it's not easy. It's doable. It's necessary, but it's not easy. And because people are making so much money in destructive ways, people with a lot of money and power want to keep the old values intact, and in fact can't even imagine existing with a better set of values.
Others chime in.
Well, I'd add to that there is a fundamental structural dimension to the tragic predicament that we're in. I'm referring to the collective action problem, or collective action tragedy, as it's more accurately described, of climate. Similarly, of AI. I've been arguing recently, I don't think it really makes a lot of sense to think about climate anymore in separation from AI, because the massive rapid growth of AI is one of the new dimensions of this tragic predicament that we're in. It seems pretty clear that on balance, AI is going to make the climate situation and the ecological situation quite a lot worse. And the collective action tragedy is that it's in everybody's interests to do the right thing collectively, but everybody has selfish individual interests that point in the opposite direction. Selfishly, individually, everyone's incentivized to carry on using fossil fuels and hope that everyone else stops. Selfishly, individually, everyone's incentivized to carry on using AI and hope that everyone else stops, so we don't get the AI catastrophes that are coming down the line at us. That is incredibly hard to deal with. When it's a global level situation. So one aspect of this is that we should be not too hard on ourselves at the fact that we are failing absolutely miserably. It's a impossibly difficult conundrum to try to act upon. And I would agree with Brian that if we're actually going to get where we need to get on it, which is looking incredibly unlikely, but if we actually are going to do that, I think it will only happen if there is some kind of mass, more or less spiritual awakening. A consciousness shift is required. I hope we'll talk about climate adaptation and resilience building on this call, because I think that's an enormous area of hope now and an enormous area of necessity. But if we're going to get beyond that to actually decarbonizing and being precautious in a genuine, full-throated way and ending the insanities of would-be endless economic growth and so forth, I don't think that's going to be possible without an actual mass and relatively rapid, by which I mean a generation or two, shift in consciousness. That's an enormous ask, but if we're actually going to avoid a dodo-style future, I think that's the kind of ask we need to make.
Yeah, and we will get to this adaptation thing. One of the points that Rupert makes and has made in our podcast with him is that and Brian, you kind of said it, the old way is dying, right? It's not working. And Rupert has really made the point in his book and work that it's too late not to have adaptation. But let's come back to that. It's really important, Pete. But Bill, I want to give you a chance. What do you see as the main barrier that is in the way of us really making progress, and respond to what the others have said as well?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things that we're really dealing with here is the nature of time. The physical degradation of the planet is now happening enormously rapidly. We're used to thinking of things taking geologic time. And it's like, well, in the Devonian, over 8 million years is what happened. We're watching extraordinary changes in the Earth's systems in a matter of just one season on to the next. You don't want to look at, yesterday's report on where Arctic ice is and this December begins this year, for instance. And that means that any plan that we have for how to slow this down has to happen really fast to make much difference. Because once these things get going, then they're off and galloping. I think that the fact that we're finally seeing something else happening at a rapid pace, that is, over the last 3 years or so, this quick beginning of the conversion to energy from the sun and the wind and batteries, is a very good and promising thing. Not to stop global warming, too late for that, but to start shaving tenths of a degree off how hot the planet gets, and to start breaking up the power of the, giant wealth formations that blight our planet. I think the rapid rise of solar energy stands a reasonable chance of taking a bite out of both the climate crisis and the authoritarianism crisis. But the problem is that question of time, because of course, the people who benefit from the current world system understand this too, and are engaged in a all-out stalling action to keep us from making progress in the short window of time we still have. So, I think what'll be interesting, and what the fight is, I think, for the next 4 or 5 years, is to see how much we can overcome that power, how much we can build out a local, liberating, clean energy system. And then I think we're also Rupert's actually, exactly right. We're at the same time and following on going to have to be figuring out how on earth we adapt to that which we can no longer prevent. But I think that a key part of that adaptation actually is also involved in this build out of energy that we have some hope of controlling at a more local level and doing it really fast. I think this is the one truly subversive thing at work on the planet today. And I'll just finish by saying, I think the notion that nobody is, at work on this, or that all power is on the other side, is wrong. The biggest government, biggest economy on earth, the Chinese, are now at some level fully engaged in this process with very difficult to determine outcomes, but there are wild cards at play that weren't at play even a few years ago.
Yeah, and let me note that there are also win-win-wins to be had, which unite adaptation and mitigation and nature preservation. So a key example, an absolutely key example, is retrofit, adequate insulation, etc. When we insulate our houses adequately, we make ourselves more comfortable, we reduce the cost of living. If we do it right, we reduce our exposure to extreme heat and extreme cold. And of course, we reduce energy waste, we stop heating the sky and save carbon all at the same time. And
Rupert, the UK government's actually been putting some money into this in the last year or two. Is that right?
Well, yeah, it's a mixed picture here in the UK. I mean, we're pathetically adrift of where we should be. And there's been failed government programs, which unfortunately have given this a kind of a bad name, including ones where people have had to remove the insulation because it's caused health problems and so forth. But yes, there is some effort from the new Labour government to put more money and resource behind this. It's nowhere near enough, though. Some of you will be aware that the UK government, the Labour government, has a mission to decarbonise the electricity supply in this country, which is great, but it's not accompanied, I'm afraid, by any mission to build the ruggedization of that infrastructure, nor more generally to adapt to the climate damage that is here and the worst damage that is baked in. And whatever they don't give emission status to, they don't resource adequately. So one of the big things that we're trying to do now in the Climate Majority Project is get a real shift occurring in consciousness and on the ground in the direction of taking climate adaptation seriously, especially, of course, when it is done in these kind of win-win ways. This is what we call transformative or strategic adaptation. We regard this as absolutely critical now at this moment.
You know, Rupert, I want to pick up on something you said and turn it to everyone here. I'm very intrigued by your idea, even of climate majority, right? Because in some ways, like if you just look at polling, we're at climate majority, meaning more than half the world thinks that this is important.
Absolutely.
But the truth is that when it comes to political will or daily decisions, the price of eggs probably has a much bigger impact on who we elect than climate. So, Rupert, I want to start with you, but I ask others, how do we really get to climate majority in the sense of, because I think you know what I'm saying. We're at majority technically, but we're not at majority in terms of the will to really put the hands to the plow, either personally at a full level or collectively. So talk about that.
Yeah. So the fundamental idea of the Climate Majority Project, and if you want to know all about it, there's another book you can get about that. The fundamental idea is, yes, as you say, John, there is already a climate majority. We must never let anyone obscure that. And it's a big majority in most countries, but it's not very deep, and it's often not very salient, and it's not very self-aware. And it's not very mobilized, right? So that's where the game is. That's where the task is. And we argue now that one of the key ways that we're always looking for leverage points. Another one, for example, is the insurance industry. We've just put a little film out about that. Maybe I'll bung it in the chat during this call, which we think is an incredible potential, ally, frankly, in the common struggle we have here. But a key leverage point, which is widely accessible and absolutely critical, is climate adaptation, because it evades the collective action tragedy, because it's tangible to people, because it has these various potential win-wins. And because it depolarizes, because it generates agency. And so what we're partly saying is to build the climate majority more, to make it deeper, to make it more self-aware, to enable it to be more mobilized. One of the main things we need to do is increase the salience of questions of adaptation and resilience. Now, that is happening. It's happening in this country, and it's happening in quite a lot of the world, and it's happening reasonably quickly. The problem is, as so often, that it's not happening quickly enough, and it's not nearly resourced enough, and that a lot of institutions, frankly, are behind the curve. And by institutions here, I mean to include climate policy, climate politics, most of the climate movement, most of the media have got a lot of catching up to do. And the danger is that in the meantime, the running gets made by actors who do not have everyone's collective self-interest and common future at heart. I'm thinking of people like our esteemed, very rich friend or not so friend, Bill Gates, who has been talking about adaptation recently and getting headlines with it. But he's talking about it in a way which is too technologically focused, insufficiently focused upon a wider mobilization, insufficiently strategic, insufficiently transformative. We need to own and define this question of climate adaptation. Otherwise, it will get owned and defined by the Bill Gateses of this world, or worse still, by the hard right or the far right.
And by the way, let me just say, I love the chat that's going on and kind of watching a little bit. I always feel there's two dialogues going on here. There's the dialogue you all are having, which is really important, and the dialogue that we're having, and they're equally important. So keep that dialogue going. Bill, you've been taken to the streets for a long time and getting people to the streets. What is the role of activism in this? And does it have a downside as well? And I say this because I talk to a lot of people in business, and there's kind of two things that happen. After a while, there's a kind of also negative reaction to taking to the streets, as well as the positive. So what's your thought on the role of activism? Right? And I mean the traditional take to the streets activism versus, let's say, political organizing, et cetera. What are your thoughts on that? I'm being deliberately controversial here, but some people would say it's not all the good side, that traditional activism. Talk a little about what role you think that plays now, and maybe some mistakes we've made. And I'd like to get into that in a moment here. What are some mistakes we've made in the climate movement that we need to address? But over to you, Bill.
Well, I mean, I just think that there are a lot of things in an activist toolbox and a lot of different tools to use. I mean, at Third Act, we've done a lot of work in the streets, and I'm very proud of the fact that older Americans are showing up in huge numbers for the No Kings demonstration. We had a little holiday at Third Act when Stephen Miller, the president's henchman, said everything was going great in his militarized Washington, except for the fact that elderly hippies kept appearing to scream at them. So we took that as vindication of our efforts. But we also have a PAC, Gray PAC, that works in political races. I'll be on the phone shortly with one of the candidates for governor of New York. We did a big Silver Wave tour. There's lots of work, before the election, and we'll do it again this year. There's lots and lots of that kind of political action. It takes all kinds of things, including great work at the kind of more, what would you say, atmospheric level. So we did this thing called Sunday in the fall, where we had 500 events across the country celebrating the rise of renewable energy. In the wake of that, we've had about 20 state legislatures that are now considering balcony solar, plug-in solar, that are working hard to streamline solar permitting. We can't do anything in Washington right now, but we can do a lot at the state and local level. And we're seeing this globally too. I mean, on our list of good headlines and things to draw a cheer from, the fact that the human being with perhaps the single largest global following, the new Pope, has made it abundantly clear that he's following his predecessor Francis in the climate fight, and that indeed the Vatican will by next year be the first fully solar-powered nation on planet Earth, is a good reminder of, that we've got allies to work with and things to build on. So I think there's good work to be done on many, many fronts. And truthfully, I don't think that I think the climate movement's done a pretty good job over the years. We spent the first 35 years of the climate fight in a world where fossil fuel was relatively cheap and renewable energy relatively expensive. That constrained everything that we could do. Most of the work that we were doing was around making fossil fuel more expensive, carbon pricing, divestment, infrastructure, attacks on infrastructure expansion, like the Keystone Pipeline, whatever. Now, as of 5 years ago, that has flipped, and we're in a world where the economic force of gravity is working in our favor. And the fossil fuel industry in some ways is on the back foot, which they recognize, and it's why their political gamesmanship has stepped up by an order of magnitude. So it's a ongoing, difficult, shifting fight, but I'm proud of the work that people are doing all over the place.
Well, I think one of the points you make, Bill, is so important is it's going to take all of these things. Yeah. It's going to take work at the local level. It's going to take work at the individual level. It's going to be in the streets. It's going to be political action behind the scenes. It's going to be technological advance. It's going to be all of these things. But Brian, I want to turn to you for a moment, because one of the things, you've said we need kind of a spiritual rebirth again, in the broadest sense of that. But humanity does not have a lot of practice doing that. We may have a lot of practice doing it individually. We go to retreats, we meditate, whatever our kind of various ways we come to these things. And certainly at EAN, Elders Action Network, we have a regenerative elder deep program that people can go through. But Brian, how do we do this at scale? And, in your book, you really talk about it begins with us, but how do we do this spiritual awakening at the larger landscape? I wonder your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, let me build on something that Bill just said. When you're thinking about how all of those years the climate movement had to work against an economic headwind because it was more profitable for those years to keep doing the fossil fuel thing rather than to convert. I think we have something similar going on. We'll have a similar transition go on in the religious world, because there is a kind of religion that is focused on domination. Even the image of God is God as a dominating potentate, a supremacist. We call it a supreme being, but God is a supremacist being. And that reinforces a kind of human supremacy over nature. There's a whole way that these deep theological assumptions express themselves in an exploitive relationship with the earth, as well as an exploitive relationship between one group of people and another group of people. And when people started saying that's not the only way to think about God and spirituality and religion is through this whole model of domination, there were very few voices saying that. And I think we have two things happening now at the same time, and there's a way to see both of them as positive. We have people within religious and theological communities who are doing all of the work. I just can tell you, as somebody who lives in this world, the theoretical work, the progress that's been made in the last 20, 30 years is staggering. The infrastructure is there for this change to happen. The other thing that's happening is a lot of people are leaving traditional religious structures, and their departure is a vote of no confidence in those structures. And it seems to me that we'll reach this sort of critical moment. I hope it happens very, very soon, when the word gets out that there are spiritual communities for whom a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship is vital and is central to their spirituality. At that point, I think we'll be able to see a mobilization of those spiritual communities.
And it's possible that some of all this stuff is being speeded up by the sheer insanity of the MAGA Trump stuff. Like this, Brian says, this has been going on for a long time in the kind of weird hijacking of Christianity by the right wing has been happening for a long time. But now it's just insanely clear. I mean, these guys are, just invoking Christianity to justify exactly the opposite things the Gospels tell us to do, for instance. So it just becomes much, much clearer. And it's possible that they'll win, and that, we'll live in an Orwellian hellhole, at least in the States and maybe other places too. But it's also possible that people are really starting to understand at some gut level that we need to take on the concentrations of wealth and power in our society and change them in more fundamental ways. And I'm a little heartened by what's happened in the last few months in this country, watching people begin to rise up without, it must be said, a whole lot of leadership from, say, the Democratic Party or something. It really is great organizing happening on the ground.
Bill, you did by the way, Bill did a great article. I think it was for The
Yes.
Guardian recently.
That was fantastic.
They're doing to America now what they did to Christianity. I really recommend you read that article, and you realize Brian and I share a background. I was a Presbyterian minister. He was a minister in a different tradition. And to see what has been done in the name of Jesus. And anyway, Bill wrote a great article on that. I recommend it highly. Yeah. Rupert, you've talked a lot in your work about the role of community, right? Which is where a lot of true transformation happens. Talk to a little bit about this, not tension, but what's the role of local communities really stepping up versus this large landscape? You mentioned, for example, the collapse of COP as a hope of transformation, that the world's all going to come together at the political level to do so. Can you talk a little about that? Because you write and speak a lot about that.
So let me start with a remark about responding to what Bill said when he said it's possible that they'll win. It is possible that they'll win and that we'll live in an Orwellian hellhole. But if that happens, it won't be for long, because that will hasten the generalized collapse of civilization, which may have already begun. The future is definitely going to be, on balance, more local. That will be because we collapse, in which case it will definitely be more local, or because we manage to find some way of kind of catching the pieces as they fall and moving to something like a sort of bioregional type future without having to endure a total civilizational collapse. The chances that we'll succeed in that latter path may not be that great, but they have to be aimed for. And of course, the good news here is, well, a couple of things let me focus on. Firstly, it's kind of what people want, by which I mean human beings hunger for nothing more than community, right? Basically, what most people want to do with quite a lot of their lives is things like sit around an open fire, having a drink, or meditating, or whatever it might be, making music with some friends of theirs or with people they've just met. That kind of thing, which you see like all the time at festivals, for example, is so much something that we want. And the civilization that we have right now is in so many ways radically dissatisfying us and making us miserable and so forth. That there's a kind of direction of travel here, a kind of potential North Star, which hits multiple good objectives simultaneously. And the second point, of course, is that however bad things get, there's always a kind of recourse to climate adaptation, deep adaptation, community resilience building, etc., as a sort of default setting of kind of resistance and recovery. So this direction of travel, this North Star, as I called it, it's what we need anyway in order to reduce our carbon emissions, etc., reduce food miles and so forth. It's what we actually want and hunger for. Yeah. And it's what gives us the best shot if, as is quite likely, things really do start in some radical way to fall apart. That's what this slightly older book that myself and Jem Bendell did, Deep Adaptation, is all about. Some of you may have heard of Deep Adaptation. The idea there is specifically adaptation that takes into account the likelihood that we are going to collapse as a civilization. But what I'm getting at is that deep adaptation and transformative adaptation and community building, they all point in the same direction. So one thing I like to say to people, for example, is if you are engaged in any activity that strengthens your community, then you are building climate resilience and emergency resilience. So for example, like a football team, right? If you're helping a football team, that's building climate resilience, because in a general sense, you're building community. And in a specific sense, you're also building networks of mutuality between people who are helping themselves stay physically fit, right? Next time there's a flood or something, before the official first responders get to you, it might well be someone from your local soccer team or your local school or whatever who pulls you to safety. So this is an example of what I meant much earlier when I said I think we can draw real succor and strength from the fact that as things get worse, there is the potentiality and the reality of us building together things that help us to make the best of a bad situation. Every cloud in that sense really does have a kind of silver lining.
I hope you're enjoying this informative and engaging dialogue that we're having with Brian, Bill, and Rupert as much as we are. And we'll get back to it in just a moment. But I want to first of all thank you for being a part of our community. And I'd like to encourage you to subscribe to our podcast on whatever platform you're watching or listening to this right now. First of all, it helps you. You'll hear about every event and every podcast before anyone else does. Second, it helps us tremendously to spread the word about these good and important ideas. And please make a comment. We want to hear from you. The more that we engage in the dialogue, which is exactly what this is about today, all of us can engage in that dialogue online. And please check out our website at wayforwardpodcast.com. We're so excited that you're a part of this community because we're engaged in these important conversations. And finally, we're going to be having another one of these soon. So you want to sign up at our website or subscribe so you won't miss the next one that we'll be doing on democracy in the new year. Now let's get back to this important conversation we've been having. By the way, just a comment, then I'll turn it over to one of our guests. Please start to put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat, in the Q&A. My co-host for the Way Forward podcast, Alain Gauthier, is monitoring that. And in just a few moments now, we'll start to get to some of your questions. Any response, Brian and Bill, to what Rupert just said?
Actually, I wanted to ask a question if I could. I'm really interested, Rupert and Bill, what both of you would say about this. It feels to me we're in this sort of both and time when we're doing everything we can to work with large structures, from the United Nations to national governments to, the COP and all of the rest. We want to work with large structures, but there's also this sense that we might not win in time, even though we might make progress. I remember once, Bill, you saying to me that winning too slow is the same as losing when you're in a timed test. And so then it seems to me, while that's going on, is this growing sense that we need to create local, regional, bioregional structures that will pick up the pieces when the larger systems fail. And I didn't hear people saying that as much 10 years ago. I think there were a few saying it, but it feels like that's something that's growing. I'd love to just hear each of what your thoughts are on that.
10 years ago or 20 years ago, we still had more pathways out. We weren't as deep in the hole as we are now. Now we're very deep in the hole. And you can make a perfectly plausible case too deep in the hole to, some of the physical forces we've unleashed are truly terrifying. Let's assume for the moment that they're not terminal. I think that I think that what Rupert and you were saying about the need to be building local adaptive response through community is absolutely crucial. It's what I've spent much of my life writing about and working on here in, where I live. I think that over the next 5 years, the single most important of all those survival strategies is to build as many solar panels as we possibly can, and as much wind energy and all the stuff that is going to be the thing on which we build whatever comes next is going to be built on the back of. And the chances for that thing prospering, surviving, whatever, are greatly increased if it has a working power supply as we build it out. These are not sequential. You do them all at the same time. But I got to say, in my mind, the time frame is something like the next 5 years is this period where we hope we can stay on this rapid ascending S-curve of clean energy build out. I think by 2030, we're going to have no choice as a civilization but to face some very hard truths about where the physics of climate change has us. But I'd much rather do that in a world where A, we have a lot of clean energy capacity, and B, where that clean energy capacity has begun to break the political back of the fossil fuel industry. So it and its associated industries are no longer able to utterly dominate the discussions that we have about this, which they do at the moment. The COP process, for instance, is sort of run aground, as Rupert says, and I don't think it's coming back. I'd much rather have that conversation from a position of more strength than we have right now.
So let me make 2 points. Firstly, in terms of the build out of solar and wind and so forth, as I implied earlier, I think it's absolutely critical that all such build outs are ruggedized. And I mean that in at least 2 ways. Firstly, ruggedized against likely future, more severe climate impacts. And that includes, crucially, by the way, the potentiality for not just more stormy weather, but colder weather. Because as was hinted earlier by Bill, I think, we may in North America and Western Europe, ironically, be facing over the next decade or two, we don't know, we may be facing at the beginning of a colder future if the Atlantic currents really do get completely shafted by the melting of Arctic ice. And real adaptation means readiness for that kind of potentiality. The other way in which I'm talking about ruggedization is we need to have ruggedization against failures of the grid for whatever reason, which might be military conflict or whatever reason. So in other words, there needs to be quite a lot of genuine local resilience in whatever renewable energy we put in.
Batteries, baby. Batteries.
Yeah. Batteries, obviously a key part of it. I think also there'll probably be a bigger role in future for gravity storage solutions in especially in parts of the country where that's easier to make happen physically. The second point I want to make is I want to make a further defense of the absolute importance at this time of transformative and strategic climate adaptation. And it's this. We're still in a situation, as we were talking about earlier, where the climate majority is mostly not really mobilized, mostly not really clear about just how bad the situation is, the kind of stuff we're talking about on this call, etc. We believe in the Climate Majority Project that the best way now to bring home to, there's a number of such ways, but that the best way now to bring home to people how rough the situation is and to actually get them into being part of the climate majority and understanding that they are there together with, vast oceans of other people in this struggle for our lives is to start to actually engage in climate adaptation resilience behaviors. That makes this much more concrete, much less abstract. For many people, the climate question is still awfully abstract. We have this awful term net zero that gets bandied about as our objective. It's, totally abstract, technocratic discourse. But it's not, my point is not just even about discourse. It's about saying at the level of discourse and at the level of action, if we get people into doing climate adaptation, then we're doing something quite kind of subversive because we're making the climate question something which is real and present to them and something that they're doing something about. And that sort of occludes any possibility of thinking any longer, well, maybe someone else is going to fix this. Maybe it's not as bad as they say. Isn't it something to do with 2050? And I can't really see it, etc. No, you're doing something about it. It's here and now. It's going to get worse. We're protecting ourselves together. So our argument is that taking climate adaptation seriously now is a kind of mind bomb. It's the best way to actually get people deeper into this space. And in that way, it's going to be a critical thing to actually increasing the pressure over time for decarbonization. I would put it as strongly as this. If you want to be in the best possible position now to help decarbonization in this world, as it is today, engage in climate adaptation, because that mind bomb will help that process, if it ever is going to get truly, fully jump-started, to take that direction.
So our audience is chomping at the bit. We've got a lot of questions in there. So in a moment, I'm going to just hear a voice from afar, which is my co-host, Alon Gauthier, is going to bring in. Obviously, we can't get to the 40 plus questions that are there. One interesting point about what you were just saying, Rupert, I remember during the great financial crisis, there was a headline in USA Today. It said, times are so tough, people are even growing their own food. And I was thinking, like, how for thousands of years, human beings grew their own food. But it is a radical idea. This idea that we in our communities start to do things is the beginning of the kind of thing you're talking about. So, Alon, my co-host, just his voice is going to come in. Alon, give us a question to throw to our panel here.
Yeah, I'll start with questions that have been raised several times. One of them is, if we raise a boycott movement, like the one that forced Paramount Disney to reinstate Jimmy Kimmel, or the Tesla takedown, who would be the best targets?
Okay, great. Excellent. Who'd like to take that, maybe just one or two of you? Who's the best targets right now?
I think Bill should start with that one.
I was thinking Bill.
I don't think we have a real boycott target here. So, the Jimmy Kimmel thing was fascinating, but it was an incredibly concentrated target. People were canceling their subscriptions to Paramount, and that produced enough agita that they backed down and put them back. The problem with boycotting the fossil fuel industry has always been the fact that it produces a resource on which most people still depend, and that it can store that resource for a long time. And I think probably in America, the most straightforward path at the moment is a lot of political organizing leading up to the midterm elections and beginning to change the dynamic of our political momentum then and there. I wish there was something we were doing sooner that was going to make a huge difference. In the meantime, we can also do a huge amount of work at the state and local level around clean energy. And that's, the third act, we have this big Simplify Solar project that really has gotten legs, as I say. We've got about 20 states now, I think, where we're going to have balcony solar, plug-in solar as a big issue in the next little while. And that's exactly the kind of ruggedized, local, sort of head-changing intervention that Brian and Rupert are talking about. So, I wish there was an easy kill switch here, but I don't think there is. We're up against extraordinary concentration of power in America. And the good news is, and it's the only piece of good news, is that it's also an extraordinarily unpopular concentration of power at the moment. Americans are waking up to the fact that complete lunatics and amoral people are taking over in a way that even in America's dark history we've never seen before. And that's good news. That's the basis from which we organize, but it's going to be hard organizing, long slog.
Rupert, you have any targets? I hear you saying, Bill, it's like whack-a-mole. There's no one that we can do, and that political organizing is probably the most important thing we can do. But Rupert, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, whatever we do, it needs to be smart. As you were alluding to earlier, John, it is possible sometimes, it happens sometimes, that climate activism does set things back. I have to give, sadly, as an example, some, not all, but some of the nonviolent direct action we've had in the UK in the last few years. The work that was done by Insulate Britain, for example, I think basically just made the cause very unpopular. So we need to, if we're going to do sort of classic negative activism, it needs to be very well targeted and picked. Well, the way I like to think about this is try to couple negativity with positivity. So, for example, something which hasn't happened yet, but I think we might just be at the cusp of it becoming possible, is for there to be serious activism, partly on a consumer basis, around insurance. Right? We're getting into the insurance crisis now, and insurers are moving from having a reputation of being sort of dull grey men in suits to being villains and part of the problem. What we need to do, it seems to me, is to target some of those villains and at the same time support or create those insurers who are not going to be villainous in that way, but are actually going to offer paths towards the future. So I would always try to couple a boycott with a sort of pro-cot, if that's a word.
A great example of that, Rupert, is I have a large telecommunications company in Canada who's a client of mine. They have a big presence in Alberta where the oil sands are. So they did some pretty strong stances on climate. And then people started like boycotting them in parts of Alberta. What was really interesting was the people who were customers but were supportive of climate change didn't rise to the occasion to like really come out in social media, et cetera, saying, no, tell us, we believe in what you're doing. So you make a really important point. We tend to think of activism as just negative reaction, but do we support companies and players when they do the right thing? Otherwise, all they hear from are the negative people. Alan, let's get another question.
There's some good, I'll just add, there's some very good comments in the chat about important targets that continue to remain. The big four banks in the States are egregious in their endless support of fossil fuel, along with RBC in Canada. And people are continuing to do good work around them. You can find, if you're interested, at Stop the Money Pipeline, really good efforts going on there. And there's this excellent work happening in a lot of places on this Make Polluters Pay or Climate Superfund legislation. We've managed to get it passed in Vermont and New York. And I was just at a big rally in New Jersey where it's a live issue as it is in California. And this really is an effort to send a bill, as it were, to the fossil fuel industry for the climate damage that they've done. In a truly just world, the receipt from that bill would be going to low-lying Pacific Island nations and large parts of Africa. But it's a start to be trying to take a chunk out of Exxon's hide anyway. So there's another couple of possibilities.
Thank you, Bill. Good point. Alan, do we have another question?
Yes, there were a couple of questions about alternative sources of energy, nuclear, ammonia, and I was wondering whether, and some of these subjects are a little bit challenging to address, but I wonder whether we could have an answer on that.
Well, I'll just say in general, I mean, I don't think it's worth having a huge fight about whether or not what to think about nuclear power. We know the drawbacks. To me, they seem smaller than the drawbacks of an overheated planet. I mean, something actually has to go wrong at a nuclear power plant. You run a gas power plant according to spec and it destroys the earth. But I think that these questions should be fairly moot, simply because nuclear power at this point is extremely expensive. And it's competing with something, solar, wind, and battery power, that's now extremely cheap. And I mean, Rupert will have more idea, but the latest numbers I've looked at, seen from whatever they're calling it, Hinkley nuclear power plant that they're trying to build in the UK, are almost comical, unless you're a British ratepayer, in which case they're somewhat nightmarish.
Yeah.
The main tool, and things like ammonia and hydrogen and stuff, I think are basically sideshows for many of the same reasons. The tools that we have in the time that we have are sun, wind, and batteries. These are now the cheapest ways to produce power on Earth. They're relatively benign compared to what we've been using. They're amenable to local control, and they have deep human connections. I mean, the sun already provides us with light and warmth, and via photosynthesis, our supper, now it's willing to provide us with most of our power. That's a good thing, especially because humans like the sun. I mean, I don't mean to speak for all humans, but as far back in history as we can go, back there in Rupert's British Isles, people were arranging rocks in lots of patterns to point out when the solstice and the equinox were coming. So I think that's the place to be putting one's bets, both metaphorical and literal.
Can I just add on the UK dimension of nuclear? Bill is right. We need to ask ourselves, what does it mean for something to be very expensive? And of course, ultimately, it's pretty well correlated with ecological impacts. Something is very expensive because it requires a great deal of work, materials, time, etc., to make it work. So I would say that's a kind of pretty good prima facie indicator that nuclear power does not make a lot of sense at this moment in history, certainly compared to the alternatives that Bill has been strongly and rightly mentioning. The other point I would make is that we do need, tragically now, to take very seriously the possibility, which is probably a probability, that our civilization at some point, we don't know when, we don't know how, is going to collapse, that we are faltering, as Bill has put it. Now, if you have a collapsing civilization, honestly, one of the absolute last things you want is nuclear power plants lying around with their waste, with their potentiality for going wrong if they're not adequately maintained, with their potentiality for being looted and turned into dirty bombs and et cetera, right? We actually, I'm afraid, folks, have to think about this now. We have to think, this is part of deep adaptation. How do we guard ourselves and guard our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren? Remember how long the legacy of nuclear can be. We have to guard them against collapse, if and when it comes, being worse than it otherwise could be or should be. And that, for me, is an argument against nuclear, which isn't taken nearly seriously enough. But I think
that's a good point, guys. I'm afraid I have to jump. I'm very sorry
Bill. We appreciate it.
missing you, but what a great conversation, and many thanks to John and Rupert and Brian for real leadership here. On we go, guys.
Thank you, Bill. Keep up the great work. By the way, good time for me to say, number of you said you're loving this conversation, not done yet, we got a lot more to go, is that if you really are loving this, you will love the Way Forward podcast. This is exactly what we do. Sometimes we have one guest, sometimes we have several. I said all three of these folks have been on the podcast. A lot of great men and women and people have been on the podcast with us. Jim, our producer, is going to put in the chat right now our link tree. If you don't know what link tree is, just click on link tree and it will both take you to our podcast website, to YouTube, to Apple, wherever, whether you audio or visual person. And please subscribe to the podcast. And you're going to want to check out these previous podcasts. So Jim, please put the link tree for our podcast in there. Before we get to another question from the audience, Brian, since doom was mentioned a moment ago, I want to talk a little bit about doom. One of the things you said in your book and in our podcast with you that we did a few months ago was, I don't know if I get it exactly right, but you said that, hope and pessimism or doom are both dangerous. And one of the things we know is that a lot of cognitive dissonance is, if you just talk about doom long enough, people either get converted or they turn you off. That's human psychology, right? Because it's just too difficult. Can you talk, Brian, a little bit about this tension, optimism, pessimism, doom, hope? Because you talk about it very profoundly in your book.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it is complicated. And so before I say anything, let me sort of make a plea to everyone who's listening. For the next couple of minutes, I'd like to invite people to try to withhold their reaction. Because here's the thing. Our human brains seem to be wired to want closure. And so we want to have closure. Everything's going to be fine. And if we can't have that, there's a certain part of us that seems to want closure. There's nothing we can do. It's hopeless. Both of those give us this sort of position, this permission to return to our previously scheduled apathy and complacency. And so I am suspicious of anything that invites me into complacency and apathy. But I also want to say, I think there's a certain sense that people want to shame people by calling them doomers. And let me make an observation about that. I'd love to hear what Rupert thinks about this as well. I think there's a psychological experience for people who were raised in a fossil fuel culture. One of the things that a fossil fuel culture did to us is it made us think we could solve any problem. Technology, with easily available energy, it gave us this strange feeling of omnipotence. We can solve any problem. We can do anything. And I think there's a moment that many of us experience for the first time in our lives. We think, oh no, our problems have grown bigger than our solutions, or even more terrifying, oh no, every solution that we have perpetuates the problem. And when that feeling sort of goes up your spinal cord and works its way through your nervous system, what's happening is you're saying, the way I've seen, one of my basic assumptions of life is now under question. That is psychologically unnerving, if not traumatizing. And I think many people, when they use the word doom, that what they're doing is they're describing that feeling has happened to me. Now, maybe some people will get through this without that feeling ever happening to them. But here's what I would say. If you're able to go through that feeling, it's a little bit like the stages of, or the phases of grief. One of them is depression, but the depression prepares you to say, there might be solutions that I've never thought of yet, or changes might be necessary I never would have been open to before. And that whole process is delicate, and we all go through it in different ways, and it's messy. And we need communities that are holding containers for people to go through that kind of process.
Yeah, and by the way, and Rupert respond, but if you want to really have a spiritual grounding for, and even in the broadest sense of spiritual grounding, psychological grounding, read Brian's book, Life After Doom. Rupert, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm loving what Brian has to say here. Very, very much on board with it. In terms of grief, I would say, I've written about this at some length, that it's important to be clear that the stages of grief are necessary stages. It's typically not possible, if the grief is serious enough, to just sort of skip one. And I've argued that they're all actually forms of acceptance. Even denial can be a form of acceptance.
Yes.
But acceptance is a process that has to unfold. And as Brian says, we have to find ways of undertaking that process, usually together. There's a limit to the extent to which it's possible for people to do this individually. And that certainly goes for ecological grief, which is going to be more and more widespread in the coming years. And those of you, probably quite a lot of you on the call who, like me, have experienced a lot of that already. Sometimes one thinks something like, oh, I wish I didn't kind of worry about these things so much. I wish I wasn't such a sort of sensitive person or something. But that's actually the wrong way to think about this. This is a real kind of gift going through the experience of, say, ecological grief, or similarly, climate grief. It has real gifts in it, including spiritual gifts. It ultimately can issue, as Brian was implying, in a more kind of grounded and energized sense of what is now possible, and of determination to try to make it happen. This is central to the teaching of my teacher, Joanna Macy, whose work I've been trying to develop and extend in recent years. And finally, I would say, connecting that with the crucial point that Brian made about the temptation that people have to look for something which is going to give them an out. It's going to give them what Jean-Paul Sartre called a reprieve, an ability, a possibility of not having to actually act, of not having to actually commit. The thing which extreme optimism and extreme doomism have in common is that they both function as a kind of agency of reprieve. Extreme optimism says, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. Extreme doomism says, there's nothing you can do. Both of them have an enormous kind of psychological attraction in that way. They let you off the hook. And that is exactly why you should never give in to either of them.
Yeah, and we know humans like certainty. We're drawn to certainty, as Brian has pointed out. And so
we have to live now in a kind of profound uncertainty. That's what I was talking about earlier in relation to, what climate adaptation is actually about. And, implicit in what we've been saying is that climate adaptation is not just like a physical process. It's not even just a community process. It's also a kind of inner psychological, psychosocial, psychospiritual process. That's certainly the way that I teach it. And that dimension has been neglected. And one of the things we emphasize strongly in the Climate Majority Project is we need to unneglect that dimension. We need to take psycho-spiritual adaptation, inner adaptation, much more seriously. We need to resource it much better, including in all the places where people are exposed to these kinds of difficult truths. without, as it were, us being there to catch them. Places such as schools, for example, where when school kids get taught about the climate and ecological crisis, they find it very difficult often nowadays, if they're taught truthfully about it, as of course they should be. That should be much better resourced, and that's one of the things we're campaigning for.
Alon, do we have maybe time for one more question or so? Do you have a good one for us? They're all good questions. That's what your professors told you, right? So
yes, it's hard to choose. There's so much variety and depth. But it says, one of them, it says it's 2006, the United Nations declared that animal agriculture was the major cause of greenhouse gases. That seems to have been generally ignored by leaders in this field. I believe if we had embraced that information and acted accordingly, we wouldn't be in a mess we're in now. It's still pretty much ignored. What do you think? Why do you think that is?
Rupert, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I could make a start on that. So it's a good and important question. Well, it's certainly true that animal agriculture is a major source of climate damage and, of course, of broader ecological damage. And these things are connected. I mean, the ecological damage is a cause of the climate damage, right? So it's not just about fossil fuel emissions, important though those are. It should be taken more seriously, as the airline industry, for example, is taken seriously. Why is it not? Well, I think part of the reason is that it goes very, very close to people's self-identity, right? And we have to take questions of identity in that kind of sense more seriously than we do. Many people on this call will identify as progressive in their politics. My view is that we've become too obsessed in recent years in our politics with so-called identity politics, with whether you're black or gay or not American or whatever it is, right? But there are aspects of identity which, if we're going to progress, need to be taken fantastically seriously, because they do go deep to people's kind of core and to what they are prepared to believe, not believe, do, not do. And eating is one of those things, right? We literally, of course, famously are what we eat. So one has to be incredibly careful in this game when we're talking about animal agriculture, not to get too quickly into a position where people feel as though their sense of who they are is being attacked. And for that reason, I think we need to be careful not to overly moralize or individualize these kinds of choices. Instead, we should try to present this as something which, as the question says, has fundamental implications for all of us. And it should make sense for all of us to seek to find ways to reduce intensive farming, to reduce meat consumption, to reduce the mass monocultural industrialization of agriculture. And we should do that in a way that bases itself in science and in common sense and is sensitive to people's self-identity and fundamental preferences, rather than seeming to be a sort of attack on who they are as people. And we should also bear in mind, as I've said in answer to some questions in the Q&A, which I've been writing some answers to some of them as we've been going along, trying to keep up, which is impossible. We should also bear in mind that when it comes to people's sense of self-identity, and when it comes to people's sense of what is effective for them to do in the world, it is absolutely critical that we bring people together, right? If you make the answer to these questions seem like they're matters of individual conscience and individual action, you will piss people off and you will always fail to do enough, right? If we are going to do enough, we have to act as neighborhoods, as communities, as regions, as polities, as nations, as a species, right? We can't do it as individuals. And that needs to be emphasized, because in societies that are based around the English language, societies like the UK and the US, there is a massive liberal individualist kind of bias in our cultural setup, and it's killing us, right? We have to take collectivity seriously, and that applies absolutely also to these questions of what we eat and how we organize our agriculture.
So a related question, I guess, Rupert, that's in my mind. It feels to me sometimes like in the climate movement, we have over-focused on emissions as the main deal, rather than our whole relationship with nature. So that gets into things like agriculture, forest preservation, et cetera, right? And so I feel sometimes like we've overemphasized the human emissions and underemphasized the nature relationship and the nature-based solutions. I wonder if you have a thought on that.
Yeah, I'll make a start on that, and then I'd love to try to lead into what Brian may have to say about it, because I've got a very strong bet he's got something good to say about that question. So look, yes, we have overemphasized emissions. Let me start off with the point that this term emissions is a highly technical, abstract term. It kind of leads one into technocratic ways of thinking about this, which are not helpful and don't have a kind of lived reality for people. Now, as I was saying earlier, part of the way I think we should go beyond a narrow fixation on carbon emissions is by taking seriously climate adaptation. When we take adaptation and resilience building seriously, we're talking about something and doing something which is much more concretizable for people. It's not a colorless, odorless gas that we have to reduce by some point in the future. It's something which we can see and do every day. It's things like, for example, the impacts that farmers are receiving, that they notice and talk about all the time, the changes in the seasons, et cetera, right? So that's where I would start. Now, I would go on from that to say that the adaptation that we undertake, as you're implying, John, it absolutely has to be, to a large extent, nature-based, right? So, for example, in relation to the crucial question of flooding, which is going to get worse and worse for a long time to come in large parts of the United States and the UK, we have to look at that in a transformative and strategic way, and that means looking at it in an ecosystems-based way. It means things like restoring wetlands, restoring peatlands, upland land management, reversing failed, stupid policies of straightening out rivers and removing their flood meadows, etc. It means not building on floodplains, and on and on and on, right? So when you do adaptation right, you do it in a nature-based way. But then the final point I'd like to make is that, as we were, I think, saying earlier, and this is where I think we come back to Brian, if we're really going to get where we need to get on this, and we're probably not, but we have to try, if we're really going to get to where we need to get to, we all kind of know that political changes, economic changes, technological changes, all of these things are necessary but not sufficient, right? Ultimately, there are going to have to be changes in the ways that we are willing to live and wanting to live, changes to some extent, not total changes, but to some extent in what we value, changes which are worth calling, at the end of the day, philosophical or spiritual or religious changes. And there is no way around that. And that is true adaptation. And central to those kind of changes, I totally agree with Brian, is a kind of alignment of religion and spirituality and fundamental philosophies back with nature again. That's the link that I put in the chat before, that I'll put in again in terms of the interventions I've been trying to make recently around what I call spiritual adaptation. But Brian, over to you.
Well, first, thanks so much for that, Rupert. Everything you said, I resonate with. I was arrested by a short quote from Thomas Berry a few years ago. He said, our current situation can be summarized in 3 sentences. First, the glory of the human is becoming the desolation of the earth. Second, the desolation of the earth is becoming the destiny of the human. And then third, from this point forward, all human activities must be judged by the degree to which they contribute to a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. And I love that phrase, mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. And it seems to me a huge part of what our challenge is now in our religious communities and our educational communities, in the nonprofit and activist world, is to not only critique what's wrong with the current system. it has so much wrong with it. But we have to start planting the seeds for a vision of what a life would look like in a new system. We don't, in a sense, choose the system to give and then see what life comes from it. We're looking for life, right? And so when we imagine a life with a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship, I think that is powerful. The way I've been talking about this in recent years is to say that there are two ways of being human. We found two main ways of being human. This is an oversimplification, but it's helpful. If you remember, it's a simplification. One is the way of indigenous people who feel that we belong to the earth, that we belong to this living earth community. And then the second is the way of the colonizers, which is the earth belongs to us. And if we say, oh, this experiment of acting as if the earth belongs to us, that we humans are the supreme, that we can make whatever decision we want, we say, what would it mean to feel that we belong to the earth again? And here's the interesting thing, all of our religious communities emerged among people who believed we belong to the earth, that we're part of one story, that we're connected. And that to me is this spiritual vision I think that we need, this return to something very ancient, and yet to us it will seem completely new to feel we belong to the earth.
And so I have the difficult task now of trying to bring this to a close. I'm going to have a final quick question for each one of you, but before I do that, I want to say a couple of logistics things. First of all, thank you to all of you who have engaged today. You will, within about 5 days, get an email that will include a link to this broadcast, which we encourage you to share with others and share widely and listen again. I think we may also be able to provide the chat. I normally will ask that. We'll try to do our best to do that. I'm going to ask Jim, our producer, to put in one more time our link tree for our podcast. Because if you loved what happened today, you will love the Way Forward podcast. This is exactly what we do every time in our podcast. And I would love you to click that link tree and subscribe so you won't miss an episode. And you'll go back to the previous episodes. You'll see Rupert and Manda Scott, a colleague of his, in a recent podcast. You will see Brian. You'll see Bill. We've done all three of these folks just in the last few months, as well as many other beautiful podcasts. So thank you for being here today. Sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. We knew it was impossible. So before I bring in Jen Chandler, the director of the Elders Climate Action, to say a closing word, literally get 1 minute each for you two guys. Here's my question for you. What one piece of advice would you leave for us as individuals? And because many of us are involved in the movement in a variety of ways, what's one piece of advice you would give to the movement? And whichever one of you is ready, go first. Really only have 1 minute because we have to end at the bottom of the hour. One piece of advice for us as individuals, one piece of advice for the movement. Who's ready?
I'm ready. So it's already implicit, my key piece of advice and what I've said. People often ask me at the end of my talks, what should I as an individual do? And my reply is always the same. Don't be an individual. Right? What we do as individuals is important, but it is so much less important than what we do as communities or as movements or as professions or as institutions, etc. That is where we need to find our power. That is where we need to redress the balance. And what the Climate Majority Project is all about, and what I'm all about these days, is basically trying to help people to find their power along with others, wherever they can have maximal leverage, maybe through your church, maybe through your profession, say you're an insurer or a teacher, etc. There are many possibilities, but that's what you need to do. Find your power along with others.
Thank you. Brian.
If we're a few steps ahead of other people, don't put them in the category of wrong and us in the category of right, because we aren't where we need to be. None of us are. So maybe we could see ourselves as inviting others to join us on a journey to a place we've never been before that is a better and truer and wiser way of living with the earth and with each other.
Thank you. Thank you, by the way, both of you, for your good work, as well as Bill. You've all become friends in these last year, and we love being on the journey with you. Before I bring in Jen Chandler, at the end of every Way Forward podcast, I say these words, and they're not throwaway lines. History is not a destination waiting for us to arrive. We sometimes feel like, just things are going somewhere. History is not a destination waiting for us to arrive. What we will one day call history will be the result of what we do individually and collectively now. We are creating history right now, including by being in this podcast today. And we thank you for being here. Jen Chandler, the amazing director of the Elders Climate Action, let me bring you in to close us out.
Wow, I just don't even know where to begin with my comments to close us out tonight, or this morning, I should say. On behalf of all of us at Elders Climate Action, Elders Action Network, and the Way Forward podcast, thank you so much to Bill McKibben, Brian McLaren, and Rupert Read for joining us this morning for this tremendously important conversation. It is so inspiring and activating to hear these diverse perspectives coming together for such an important deep dive into building political and public will to address the crisis that we're already experiencing. Thank you for the work that you're all doing to help mobilize and inspire others to action. We invite all of you to join us in January for the first monthly national call of the year. We're kicking off 2026 with our partners at the Environmental Voter Project, who will be discussing how we're mobilizing for our Elders Promote the Vote project, our nonpartisan voter outreach that we do. So feel free to register now. The link is in the chat box. And make sure you're on ECA's mailing list. We send twice monthly action alerts with a number of ways that you can take action at the local, state, and federal levels, and how you can leverage your voice along with others on critical issues. Collectively, we have so much power, but only if we step forward and use it regularly. And using it through our voice, our vote, our actions, how we spend our dollars, and as Dr. Read mentioned, what changes we're willing to make. Our children and grandchildren and generations to come are really depending on the decisions and actions that we're taking now. Lastly, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't mention that today is Giving Tuesday. It's the largest day of giving for the year, and we hope that you might open your hearts and your wallets and give a few dollars to support ECA and Elders Action Network so that we can continue this important work and these incredible programs like today. So thank you so much to everybody for joining us.
Yeah, and thank you again from the Way Forward team. We love having you, and Rupert, Brian, and Bill, and Jen, thank you so much. And please, I'll give you a personal challenge. If you felt the conversation you heard today was important, when on Friday or so you get it, share it with 5 people. Everything begins with sharing. And so that's a thing you can do, a direct action. Share this with 5 people. I challenge you to do that. That means that instead of 600, we'll have thousands of people who will get to hear this dialogue. So again, thank you again. We'll see you next time on The Way Forward. Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. I'm Jim Burke, the producer. We'd like to extend our heartfelt thanks to our sponsors, Elders Action Network and Elders Climate Action, for their unwavering support in making this podcast possible. Their dedication to empowering elders to take action on climate change and social justice issues is truly inspiring. If you found this conversation as enlightening and motivating as we did, please subscribe to our podcast and YouTube channels. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these vital discussions to a broader audience. Don't forget to share this episode with your network, and let's work together to build a better world for all generations. Find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, and now on Instagram and YouTube Shorts. Together, we can make a difference. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's episode and any suggestions you have for future guests. Please send your thoughts and recommendations to thewayforwardrc@gmail.com. Your input is invaluable in helping us shape the future of this podcast. To learn more about our sponsors and get involved, visit Elders Action Network at eldersaction.org and Elders Climate Action at eldersclimateaction.org. Thank you for being part of the Way Forward community.